Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. I'm Elana Stein, Hain, and this is where we conceptualize halacha through case studies from Daf Yomi. So here's our case today. It's the case of a coerced transaction. Let's say I do not want to sell you my iPhone, but you really want me to sell you my iPhone. So you actually have someone physically restrain me until I am willing to sell you my iPhone. You give me money. I say, sure, you can have my iPhone. But clearly, this whole thing was done under duress. Should this count legally, halachically, as a valid sale? This is the subject of our conversation today. You can find a line about this on the bottom of Bava Kamma Samach Bet Amud Aleph, where Rav Huna is quoted as saying such a sale is valid. This is known as Talyuhu V'Zavin, someone who was strung up, literally physically restrained with some sort of rope, and as a result was coerced into selling something of theirs, whether karka, whether landed property, or metaltalin, movables. And he says the sale is a sale, svine svine, the sale is a sale. So I want to think about this because I think it raises a very important question about the degree to which law can actually penetrate in its judgments of things. Can it penetrate beyond what it sees on the surface? And what I mean by what it sees on the surface is if you perform all of the activities that make up a transaction, and yet it is very clear that your heart is not in it, what role should your heart play? And to be honest, you could make an argument for law actually not wanting to try to penetrate what's going on inside, but only saying if you've done the performance, the transaction is legitimate. Because the truth is, if we start probing what's going on inside, we might get to other issues like, oh, well, I was only selling you this because I wanted to move to Israel. And then I didn't move to Israel in the end. So therefore, this sale should be null and void. And you can understand where people could make all sorts of excuses as to what they were really thinking when they made a sale. On the other hand, you look at something like this and you say, well, this kind of seems egregious. I mean, clearly, if somebody is constraining me physically and saying, we'll only let you go if you sell us your iPhone, I mean, it's very clear to everybody that I don't really want to sell my iPhone, isn't it? So you don't have to do much probing in order to get there. So this is the example I want to think about today. Now, the truth is, the example of Talyu Vizavin, a person making a sale because they were coerced to another person, is not really the first place in Chazal that we see this concept of somebody might be coerced to do a transaction, and yet we consider the transaction to be valid. So I want to look at two precursors with you. In fact, the first precursor is a precursor that's taken from the very beginning of Vayikra, the way that Chazal explain it, and I'm going to share my screen. In Vayikra, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Gimel, I'm just skipping this place on the source sheet is where the issue comes up at the bottom of Samach Bet Amud Aleph Bava Kamma. More than welcome to look it up. In Vayikra, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Gimel, the discussion is bringing a korban ola, a korban that is fully burnt on the Mizbeach. Now, korban ola is interesting because for the most part, when individuals offer a korban ola, it is out of their own volition. It is true that a korban ola does offer you kapara, it does offer you expiation for certain sins, like being mivatelet a mitzvah aseh, not performing a positive commandment, but it's still something that you decide to give. Unlike, for example, a chatat, where when I do certain sins, I have a chiyuv to bring a chatat in order to gain my kapara. So that'll be important to us later because the volitional element matters. Let's take a look. Im ola korbano, if the person's korban that they're choosing to bring is an ola, min habakar, it'll come from the cattle, zachar tamim yakrivenu. They are going to give a male, unblemished animal. El petach ohel moed yakrivoto, to the opening of Ohel Moed, meaning to the Mishkan. They will bring it, lirtzono, for their acceptance, meaning lifnei Hashem, before God, meaning you're bringing this because you want God to look favorably on you. Now, Chazal took a look already in the Sifrut Tana'it, already in early rabbinic literature, Tanaitic rabbinic literature. They looked at this phrase, Yakriv oto lirtzono. A person will bring it for their acceptance. And they said, wait a second, just taking this out of its, I would say, clear contextual meaning of a person will bring this for their acceptance, we are going to read this as a person will bring this according to their own will, according to their own volition. And notice that maybe we can actually break up the phrase. So take a look at what the Sifra Halachic Midrash does with this phrase of Yakriv Oto Lirtzono, which is now being understood as will give it by their own volition. Yakriv Oto Melamed Shekofinoto. A person has to give it. If they said they're going to give an ola, they have to give it, meaning even if we force them, meaning we can even force them to do it because they said they were going to do it, and we have to force them. You can imagine a situation where somebody says, I want to give a korban ola. I plan to give a korban ola. They even make an official statement that they're going to give a korban ola, but then they start dilly-dallying. Nope, yakrivoto, they must bring it. If they said they're going to bring it, they must bring it. So we can even force them, coercion, right? But wait, it also says lirtzono, by their volition. Yachol al korcho, maybe you're allowed to make them do it even against their will. Talmud lomar, therefore, the pasuk says, no. Lirtzono. It has to be by their own volition. Now, what do you mean? You can force someone to do something of their own volition? Here we have the precursor to our example with my iPhone. Ketzad, how does it work? Kofinoto, you force a person, ad shiomar rotzani, until they say, I want to do it. What? You force the person until they say, I want to do it. Now, explain to me how forcing a person to say, I want to do something makes it no longer duress or against their volition. Well, the Sifra doesn't explain that. It simply takes for granted that it's good enough to force someone to say, I want to do this. Now, I find this fascinating because I look at this and I say, oh, this is how law works, right? According to the law, if you give me money, I hand over a product and I say, here, I want to sell it to you. The sale has been made. Do we really care that in my heart of hearts, it doesn't matter to me? I said, I did the performance. I said that I want to give it to you. The other issues that may be in the background, those are in the background, right? So this is fascinating approach, which as we'll see, the Gemara later is not okay with just saying, well, this is just a performance, and that all law cares about is the performative element on top. But actually, the Gemara is going to try to say, no. When I say rotzani, when I say I want to do this, I really, really mean it subjectively on the inside, and the law does care. But let's see when we get there. So that's the first precursor to our example of Rav Huna saying you can string somebody up, or if you string somebody up until they're willing to sell something to you and they're willing and they sell it, sale is valid. So here's our precursor, the korban ola, forcing someone to say, I want to give this korban ola and give it. So take a look at what the Mishnah in Erchin does, because the Mishnah in Erchin gives us another example, another precursor to Rav Huna's stringing people up and buying from them. Chayavei arachim, first it starts basically with our Ola example, or it starts in the world of Kachin. Chayavei arachim, people who are obligated to pay their value to the Mikdash because they made a decision. They made a declaration. I'm going to pay my value. And how you value that, that is the stuff of Masachet Erchin, but how you value that, that's not the issue here. It's that I said I would give that amount of money to the Mikdash. But let's say I'm dilly-dallying. So we say, Mimashkininotan. You can actually go to their house, go to my house, and repossess something of mine in order for payment. That's a great example of forcing someone to do something that they said they were going to do, but they're not doing it. But you can't do that with all kachim. Chayavei chataot v'ashamot, however, if you are required to bring a chatat, or you are required to bring an asham, both korbanot that come for individuals for doing certain sins, ein memashkininoto. They can't repossess items of yours in order to finance it. They cannot force you to do it. Now, it's interesting. Why is that? Maybe we just assume that eventually I'm going to give that korban because I actually have a requirement to give that korban. And so we're not really worried about this situation of, well, she's never going to give it, so we have to force her hand by repossessing something of hers, right? But on the other hand, the korbanot that are volitional for individuals for the most part, chayave olot ushlamim, people who are required to bring an ola and a shlamim. Ola burnt completely on the mizbeach. Shlamim, you eat half of it. The mizbeach eats half of it. Mimashkininotan. Then we can actually take a mashkon. We can actually take something that is able to finance it from their house, like repossess it from their house. Why? Because those things are, for the most part, volitional. So if I'm dilly-dallying, maybe I'm never going to give it, and I've already made a declaration that I have to give it. So these are examples where Chazal are talking again about this question. In the world of Kachim, can we force someone to do something? And as soon as we get to this issue of coercion by repossessing something of theirs, in this case, the Mishnah is going to bring up our issue of, but wait a minute, what about lirtzo? No, it has to be based on someone's will. Even though a person doesn't gain kapara, doesn't gain expiation until they actually want to bring this, shene'emar, as it says, lirtzo no, that it has to be based on a person's will, which again, contextually, it's actually for the person's acceptance before God, but we're reading it as by the person's own volition and will. Kofinoto achimarotzani, you force them until they say, I want to do it. All right, so this is the example that we saw before, but expanded out a little bit to tell us where else it might apply in Kachim and where it doesn't apply in Kachim. By the way, I put on the source sheet an exception to each one of these rules because, for example, there is a korban chatat where we do actually coerce, and there is an example of a korban ola where we don't actually coerce, because that's why you don't learn halacha from a Mishnah, right? There's always, always, always more. But the key to why we're looking at this Mishnah in Erchin is not just to repeat what we saw in the Sifra, but because of what Erchin adds at the end. It says, V'chein ata umer, and likewise you say, Begite nashim, when it comes to bills of divorce for women. Kofinoto adsho marutzani. You force the man to give it until he says, I want to give it. Now, let's be very clear about what this situation is and is not. In general, we say that a get that was forced is invalid. It is called a get meuseh. That is invalid. However, if you look in the Mishnah in Ketubot, Perek Zayin, Mishnah Yud, and the Gemara there, you will see a discussion of particular cases where we can, in fact, force a man to give a get, and it will be valid. There is a mitzvah legaresh. There is a commandment. There is a requirement for the husband to divorce his wife. And in those situations, we are allowed to coerce the husband to do it. So in that situation, in a situation such as that, we know that the get has to come from the volition of the husband based on the understanding of the Torah. And if that's the case, how do you coerce him? You coerce him, you beat him up until he says, I want to give it. Yet another example in another realm of a person doing a transaction under duress. This time it's not selling my iPhone to somebody under duress. This time it's not having something from my house taken in order to pay for the Korban Ola that I said it was going to give under duress. This time it's in the realm of Ishut. This time it's in the realm of having a divorce given under duress. So really interesting that we have all three of these examples from the three different places in just sort of the halachic world, right? Three different tchumim, three different arenas of halacha, from kachim, from mamonot, and from ishut. Now, we're now going to get back to Rav Huna, with whom we started. I want us to notice these two Tannaitic sources. They did not seem scandalized by the idea that you could be kofet, that you could force someone until they say rotze ani or rotza ani, I want to do something. Now, why is that? It's not clear. Maybe they felt they understood that when somebody says rotzani, rotzani, they really mean it. Or perhaps, and this is something that's really worth thinking about in general, in terms of the way halacha developed, the way that Chazal's understanding of halacha developed, it is possible, and there are those who have pointed this out, that when you look at earlier Chazal, when you look at Mishnah, when you look at Tosefta, even when you look to a degree at early Amoraim, what you see is that there is less concern with the whole conversation of what's really going on inside when it comes to at least transactions and other situations as well. And that only later within the Amoraic period do we start thinking about the subjective self in a deep way. So saying rotzani is not enough unless I really want something. And I'll give you, for anybody who's interested in people to read on that issue of the evolution from a more, I would say, performative version of volition, right? I want, I said it, that's volition. That's enough, right? To make it not just coerced, to a more subjective version of volition. What do I really feel in my heart of hearts? So one of the people who talks about this is Professor Yishai Rosenzweig. He has a few articles that are available online. I would say in a slightly different realm, Dr. Ayelet Libson talks about this in terms of the growth of Chazal's recognition of people's subjectivity about their own bodies, to be able to say, this is how I feel. I need to eat right now on Yom Kippur, for example. I am in danger. There's a sense of the subjective mattering. Or Dr. Shana Strauch-Schick, whose book is available, I assume her book is available online, which she wrote about the development of intention, of kavana, but not just kavana, but let's call it intention. Intention in Chazal, how over time, the significance, the centrality of intention becomes more of a focus, right? What's interesting about Rosenzweig, just to start with him, is that he suggests that it's not just the focus, but that even maybe when the Mishnah talks about kavana, its definition, even for mitzvot, that its definition of kavana is not necessarily always about subjectively what's inside, but to an extent, almost like being in the right context so that it's clear that what you're doing is a mitzvah, or even being aware that you're doing a mitzvah. Less so, what are you feeling inside about it, but just an awareness that you're doing it. Or even in my book, Circumventing the Law, I talk about this also, where I find that Chazal's ability to ratify loopholes where people are performing a certain kavanah, but it's so clear that that's not what they really feel inside. It seems that in earlier Chazalic material, they're more comfortable with that. And as you get to later Amoraim, they're much less comfortable with that. They want, if you're going to say something, they want you to mean it. If you're going to do something, they want you to mean it from a subjective standpoint. So that's sort of an interesting, I think that's an interesting wrinkle in all of this, going back to our question from the original discussion of like, to what extent can law really probe what the subjective individual is doing, or I should say, is thinking or feeling, versus what the person is doing externally, right? Do we judge you by your actions? How much of the subjective self do we bring into those actions? And I think it's a fair question. And what we're going to see right now in the Gemara in Bava Batra, which takes up Rav Huna Talyu Vizavin, stringing someone up and forcing them to sell something, and says, what's the logic of this? I want to understand. This is very strange. What do you mean you're coercing somebody until they're showing volition, right? The Gemara wants subjectivity. They want to really know that a person means it. It's not enough to just say, sure, I want to sell you my iPhone, when literally 5 people are holding me back and making sure I don't get up until I do. So here goes. We're going to see that probing. So the Gemara in Bava Batra, Mem Zayin Amud Bet, quotes Rav Huna, same Rav Huna quoted on Samach Bet Amud Aleph in Bava Kamma. Rav Huna says, Tell you Vizavin, if they strung him up and he sold something, Zvine, Zvine. The person's sale is valid. My time, why? Well, kol de mazvin inish ilav de honest lo have a mazvin. The truth is, a person always feels somewhat compelled to sell, right? They need money. So if a person always feels compelled to make a sale, va'afilu hachi zvine zvine, and even so, their sale is valid, then okay, what's the difference between I'm compelled to sell you my iPhone because I need the money, and I'm compelled to sell you my iPhone because people are restraining me? So the Gemara says, I don't know, we're not so comfortable with that. Maybe there's a difference between the onus, the compulsion that I feel because I need money, and the compulsion that's literally foisted upon me because people are holding me down. So the Gemara says, okay, let's try again. Let's try again to explain Rav Huna. Ela Kiditanya, it's like the following Braita. And of course, it's going to quote what we've seen already in Sifrut Tanait, in Tanaitic literature. Yakrivoto, a person has to give that Ola. Milamed Shekufinoto, teaches that we can force them. Yachol Bal Korcho, maybe you would think that you could do it against their will. No. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, Lirtzo, no, has to be based on the person's will. HaKetzad, how do you square that circle? Kofinoto ad she'omar rotzani. You force the person until they say, I want to do it. Perfect. This must be the precursor for Rav Huna. This must be the legitimating source for Rav Huna. And the Gemara says, but wait, maybe there's a difference between those two situations. Vidil Mashayni Hatam. Maybe it's different in the case of the Ola, where you force a person until they say, I want. Because they're happy to get expiation. They're happy to get kapara through this korban ola. Meaning, when they say rotzani or rotzani, it's not that they don't mean it and they're just saying it. It's they really mean it. They say, you know what? I really do want to give that because I want to get kapara on something that I did wrong. Okay, so let's try again. That can't be the precursor for Rav Huna, because here, when a person says, I want, in the case of the Ola, they really want to do it. They have something that they're gaining from it. So let's try again. So we try the other Tanaitic example. The Elami Seifa, how about the end of that Mishnah that we saw in Erchim? So too in the case of bills of divorce for women. You can force the man in particular situations, as we mentioned. You can force the man to say, I want to give. Good precursor for Rav Huna, just like you can force the man in certain situations to give the get and just say, I want, even though they're being restrained, so it's coerced. Nope, but they said, I want. That works. So too, Rav Huna says, with a sale, if somebody restrains me and I say, I want, the sale is valid. So the Gemara says, no. But maybe we have a problem there too. Maybe there's a difference. Vidil Mashayni Hatam, maybe the get case is also different. The mitzvah lishmala divrei chachamim, that there is a mitzvah to listen to what the chachamim say. Meaning, in this situation, this person is obligated by halacha to ligaresh, to give a divorce. That person, when they say rotzani, they really mean it. maybe they weren't in their right senses before. Now that we've sort of kofinotam, now that we've sort of kind of beaten it into them, they finally say, Rotzani, I really want to do this. And what they're realizing is, I want to listen to Zivrei Chachamim. They really mean it subjectively inside. It's not just a performance to say it. They really, really, really mean it. Amazing. So what we went from was a conversation about Ola and get being or possible situations of you can force someone until they say, I want, which looks like the law is only caring what you say, but not necessarily what you feel inside, to the Gemara in Bava Batra saying, no. When you force someone until they say, I want, they really, really mean it inside. And the law cares about what's going on inside. So the Gemara, now we're back to Rav Huna. What's the logic in Rav Huna? So Ella Svarahu, Rav Huna has his own logic for saying, tell you v'zav and zvine, if you restrained a person bodily and they sold, in order to get them to sell something to you, the sale is valid. Why? Agav onse gamar umakne. Because of the duress, the person decided, like really internally, they were gomer badato, gomer belibo. They committed internally with conviction and are really transferring the item to the other person's ownership. Meaning, again, when you restrain me until I'm willing to sell you my iPhone, and I finally say I'm willing, don't think that that's just an external performance and that the halacha is happy with that and says, the external performance, that's all we care about. This Gemara says, no. The svara is that because I was coerced, well, we're going to see, because I was coerced, I actually internally, I really, really feel it. I really, really want to transfer this item to you. Now, what is the logic behind that? So I'm going to share my screen again. The Rashbam has a read that I think is very helpful. He says, Rav Huna misvara didei ka'amar. Rav Huna is giving his own logic to be toch isurim because of the pain, or I don't know, is because of the pain. Let's say correlated, or I guess we'll go with as a result of the pains that I'm under in being restrained. Gamar bilibo, the person decides in their heart, umakne, and transfers the ownership. Why? Ho'il v'hi katarti. Because there are two aspects here. There's yisurim, there's pain. Yes, and I might just say, like in two kids playing the game Mercy when they try to hurt each other with their hands, if you've ever seen such a thing, and somebody at a certain point wants the game to stop and just says, mercy, 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 right? And sometimes as soon as mercy happens, they attack the other person, meaning you're just trying to get them to stop. But the Rashbam says this isn't just a case where I'm being physically coerced and therefore I say, stop, I want to give it to you. There's something else here too. Umatan ma'ot. I get money. You're not taking my iPhone. You're paying me for my iPhone. And in that case, Delomaf said midi, I don't lose anything. Ultimately, of course, I lose my iPhone, meaning if I really had an emotional attachment to it, there's something to that. And maybe, my contacts on it, I don't know. But I don't lose the value. And therefore, Rav Huna says that when I say rotza'ani, or whether I say those exact words, or I just say you can take it, I really mean it internally because of the money that you're giving me. Now, what does this tell you? If this were a case where you restrained me and made me give you your iPhone for free, we would not consider that to be a valid transaction because I'm losing something. So we don't really believe that when I say take it, I really mean it in my heart of hearts, right? Once you start thinking what's in somebody's heart of hearts, you start getting into the conversation about, well, when we can't assume that a person would really want this, then what do we do? Now, two more ha'arot here, okay, that I want to make. Number one, I want to say that there's another interesting exception to this rule of tell you vizavin zvine, that if you restrain someone physically to sell something to you, the sale is valid if they sold it to you. Not only do we say this doesn't work if it's a gift rather than a sale, but it also doesn't work if I wrote a moda'ah beforehand. If I wrote something beforehand that says, whatever transaction they're going to try to make me do, the sale that they're going to try to make me do, you should know it's against my will and I don't want it. And I love that because if I wrote that, then even if in this moment I say rotzani, doesn't work, right? Because they're playing with the question of, can you really mean it? And I've already said I can't really mean it, right? So this is all play with the issue of how much do we care about your subjective internal self and how much do we just care what you say? And which one is really considered the real you, what you wrote beforehand or what you're saying now? And then the second hara that I want to give, and chaval, this is not in that this is not our topic, right? If we were in Kiddushin, we would be talking about this, but maybe we'll get to it at some other point, which is it's interesting to try to cross-reference this conversation where we are trying to figure out what your subjective ratzon is with another conversation in Chazal, which I alluded to at the beginning. And the other conversation is called Dvarim Shebalev Einam Dvarim. Stipulations in a person's heart when they make a deal are not considered legal stipulations. And I alluded to this before saying, if I wanted to sell you my iPhone, by the way, iPhone's not a great example, my couch, because I'm moving to Israel, or I thought I was moving to Israel, but that's not something that I said in the stipulation of our deal. And then I don't move to Israel. Can I say to you, no, I only meant to sell you the couch because I was moving to Israel, right? Or better yet, are there exceptions to that rule, which I don't know if you would call it exceptions to the rule or just defining the rule, where there may be a context in which it's so obvious that the only reason I'm selling you something or giving you something is because of something that I'm going through. And then it turns out that becomes inapplicable. Then do we say, well, that's not Dvarim Shebalev? That's something that's very obvious to all. But that's maybe for another time. In the meantime, what we have done is we've probed here what looked like a quick passing line at the bottom of Samach Bet Amud Aleph in Bava Kamma. We've probed the question of to what degree does halacha need your inner self for a transaction to be legitimate? And to what degree could it even be problematic for law to be trying to probe your inner subjective intentions? And we saw that this kind of interesting, almost like middle of the road or ambivalent approach of kofinoto ad shetomar rotzeani, that we force a person until they say, I want to do something, that formulation in the Sifrut Tanait, in Tanaitic literature, does not seem to be scandalous or surprising, whereas in Amoraic literature, in the Gemara, it's sort of like, how does this work? What's the logic behind it? And I'm suggesting that perhaps you see a difference in the earlier Sifrut Tanait, less of an interest in probing whether when you said rotza'ani, you really mean it internally, or it's sufficient to do the performative rotza'ani, because law is concerned with external actions. And perhaps in the Gemara, we're asking, when you say rotza'ani, do you really mean it? And if we think you really mean it, then the transaction is valid. I hope that you enjoyed this 30-minute conceptual overview of this issue, and I look forward to continuing next week when, God willing, we will talk about Ma'aseh Shabbat, using something that was shaped in some way through Chilul Shabbat.